actually do have a question for you.
I'm afraid I can't return the favour. I was busy with lunch, so I didn't hear what you had to say.
That's why. Now, actually, precisely, first of all, I have to say I thank you very much for, again, stating the fact that the Middle East is a mosaic. It really is built upon, very different societies, complex ones, fluctuating ones as well. But you mentioned that Lebanon, to you, is the only system that used, prior to these revolutions, to display elements of democratic life, democratic political life. But as I mentioned in the presentation very briefly, some of the countries, some had facades. We all agree states could build a majlis to say that we have discussions and so on and so forth. But for instance, in the state of Kuwait, there are some elections. I was there actually when some 4 women MPs were elected. I know them. They're very liberal in their minds. And, states and, cabinets, so members of parliaments then going to the cabinet, are changed according to elections. And there are a lot of elections in Kuwait, as you probably know. So it's a sort of a dysfunctioning democracy to some extent, because there are a lot of changes in the cabinets and the parliaments. But, there is a sort of democratic life, and this is why also, as I mentioned, they were so supportive of the Arab Spring, hoping that it would give them further freedoms, political freedoms. So what do you do of the state of Kuwait? What do you do of Bahrain prior to the crackdown? How do you interpret, these different styles of democracies?
Kuwait's a fascinating one. It only really started experimenting with the democratic process in the sense of parliamentary national assemblies with elections for it and so on after the end of the Iraqi occupation. So from that point, quite recent. I actually was in Kuwait at the time of the first elections after the Iraqi occupation for a week and observed the election process. And there are all kinds of questions you can raise about the degree of democracy in Kuwait as you can about the degree of democracy in the US or Britain. Different questions. But including, for example, where does the franchise extend to? Kuwait has the big problem of the whole of a majority of Kuwaitis with Kuwaiti passports are bidun, and therefore don't have they are second-class citizens legally and can't participate, for example, in the vote.
There are a few persons, I believe, the bidun, because a friend of mine is doing her PhD research on the issue. But there are just a few persons.
It's more than just a few persons. Unless the definition of bidun has changed progressively and quite radically in the last 20 years. But what I find fascinating about the Kuwaiti environment is not so much the parliamentary elections and the assembly, and that is already an interesting experiment, but the whole concept of the diwaniyah. You have a tradition there which has kind of weakened elsewhere in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, but it is a development in the Kuwait version of the old tribal chief function, where in pre-modern times the tribal chief was not an autocratic ruler. He ruled he led by consent. By consent he was a first among equals, and one of the key elements of the tribal system was that everybody within the tribe or clan had access to the clan head, chief, or whatever. The Kuwaitis have institutionalized that in the diwaniyah. Anybody who is anybody, when they build their lovely new houses, and they have a lot of them, there's always one room set aside as a kind of reception hall. And in the Kuwaiti papers, you will see the weekly or monthly diwaniyah program. This is the day of the week from that hour to that hour that the head of that particular clan or family or political faction receives visitors. And it's completely open. Anybody can come. And in between elections when nothing's going on, I've been at some, half a dozen people turn up and there's chats and coffee, and you might get a prominent visitor invited, and it could be very often the biggest diwaniyas between political events are the ones where there's a visiting poet. And then everybody comes to listen to this poetry. But come up to elections, the diwaniyas get so big that they have to hold them in the open. And politics gets discussed very, very lively. It's a route through which a clan, large family, tribe can hold internal consultations about where they want to put their support. It's a place where people can come and lobby or hear political candidates. I mean, that first election after the Iraqi occupation, I attended 3 big public meetings of candidates. I think I may have jinxed them because all of them lost their election. They didn't get voted in. None of the ones that I attended. But the discussion was totally free. Some of it was very critical of the ruling family. And I just wonder whether that would not, if you become less ideological, less doctrinaire about what democracy is, I just wonder whether one can't accept that as a form of democracy, because it is a wide, deep process of consultation, where the process is then confirmed at the end by formal elections to a parliament. And then you have a struggle of power between parliament, within parliament, the various factions, but also between the parliament and the emir and his closest, closest family members mostly. But it's a damn sight more democratic. It's damn sight more consultative than many more formally democratic processes in small states. But try to describe the Kuwaiti system as democratic in a Western environment. You have to be very, very well prepared outside academia. But the Kuwaiti version is a fascinating example of what I would call a democratic process. Of course, the electorate is so small that they televise the counting of the election results in each election. And the elections take place in schools. And the counting is that someone sits there, picks the vote out, and reads the name against which the cross has been put, and then someone up on the blackboard goes against them, 1, 2, 3, with chalk, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is the count in the Kuwaiti parliamentary election.
Yes, is there any other question? Yeah, I have a question for Jan as well. You said that the media going into the Arab world expect to report one thing, whereas I see it as the media want us to expect one thing by their agenda.
I think you've got a problem there. The media have their own agendas, but I don't think you can put the media into one box. There is not such a thing as the media. There are very different groups within the media. There are French media, there are British media, there are American media, there are Danish media. Within the British media, as we know, in the recent years, there are certainly several very different factions or political interests which determine which way, and even within the Murdoch empire, you have variations of editorial opinions, policies, so depending on which newspaper, the News of the World is not the Times. And within the Murdoch empire, Sky Television is not Fox Television. They're both owned by the same. So you've got to be careful that we don't, in relation to the media, fall into the same trap that we accuse others